have two articles for you today, with some commentary thrown in undoubtedly. The first is called, "Yes, We Mean Literally Abolish the Police Because Reform Won't Happen," by Mariami Kaba. Congressional Democrats want to make it easier to identify and prosecute police misconduct. Joe Biden wants to give police departments $300 million, but efforts to solve police violence through liberal reforms like these have failed for nearly a century. Enough! We can't reform the police. The only way to diminish police violence is to reduce contact between the public and the police. There is not a single era in United States history in which the police were not a force of violence against black people. Policing in the South emerged from the slave patrols in the 1700s and 1800s that caught and returned runaway slaves. In the North, the first municipal police departments in the mid-1800s helped squash labor strikes and riots against the rich. Everywhere, they have suppressed marginalized populations to protect the status quo. So when you see a police officer pressing his knee into a black man's neck until he dies, that's the logical result of policing in America. When a police officer brutalizes a black person, he is doing what he sees as his job. Now, 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, of nationwide protests have led some to call for defunding the police, while others argue that doing so would make us less safe. The first thing to point out is that police officers don't do what you think they do. They spend most of their time responding to noise complaints, issuing parking and traffic citations, and dealing with other non-criminal issues. We've been taught to think that they catch killers, said Alex Vitale, the coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College, in an interview with Jacobin magazine. But this is a big myth, he said. The vast majority of police officers make one felony arrest a year. If they make two, they're cop of the month. We can't simply change their job descriptions to focus on the worst of the worst criminals. That's not what they are set up to do. Second, a safe world is not one in which the police keep black and other marginalized people in check through threats of arrest, incarceration, violence, and death. I've been advocating the abolition of the police for years. Regardless of your view on police power, whether you want to get rid of the police or simply to make them less violent, here's an immediate demand we can all make. Cut the number of police in half and cut their budget in half. Fewer police officers equals fewer opportunities for them to brutalize and kill people. The idea is gaining traction in Minneapolis, Dallas, Los Angeles, and other cities. I'll offer here that that would probably wound the beast and cripple the beast, but it won't kill the beast. And I'm not sure we can leave the beast even wounded and crippled and feel safe. I think it's good to cut their budgets in half, but I really think it's good to abolish them altogether. History is instructive, not because it offers us a blueprint for how to act in the present, but because it can help us ask better questions for the future. The Lexow Committee undertook the first major investigation into police misconduct in New York City in 1894. At the time, the most common complaint against the police was about clubbing, the routine bludgeoning of citizens by patrolmen armed with nightsticks or blackjacks, as the historian Marilyn Johnson has written. The Wickersham Commission, convened to study the criminal justice system and examine the problem of prohibition enforcement, offered a scathing indictment in 1931, including evidence of brutal interrogation strategies. It put the blame on a lack of professionalism among the police. After the 1967 urban uprisings, the Kerner Commission found that police actions were final incidents before the outbreak of violence in 12 of the 24 surveyed disorders. Its report listed a now familiar set of recommendations, like working to build community support for law enforcement and reviewing police operations in the ghetto to ensure proper conduct by police officers. These commissions didn't stop the violence. They just served as a kind of counterinsurgent function each time police violence led to protests. Calls for similar reforms were trotted out in response to the brutal police beating of Rodney King in 1991 and the rebellion that followed, and again after the killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. The final report of the Obama administration's President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing resulted in procedural tweaks like implicit bias training, police community listening sessions, slight alterations of use of force policies, and systems to identify potentially problematic officers early on. But even a member of the task force, Tracy Mears, noted in 2017, policing as we know it must be abolished before it can be transformed. We must kill the beast. We must get rid of the beast. We must start over from scratch. The philosophy undergirding these reforms is that more rules will mean less violence, but police officers break rules all the time. Look what has happened over the past few weeks. Police officers slashing tires, shoving old men on camera, and arresting and injuring journalists and protesters. These officers are not worried about repercussions any more than Daniel Pantaleo, the former New York City police officer whose chokehold led to Eric Garner's death. He waved to a camera filming the incident. He knew that the police union would back him up, and he was right. He stayed on the job for 5 more years. Minneapolis had instituted many of these best practices, but failed to remove Derek Chauvin from the force despite misconduct complaints over nearly 2 decades, culminating in the entire world watching as he knelt on George Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes. Why on earth would we think the same reforms would work now? We need to change our demands. The surest way of reducing police violence is to reduce the power of the police by cutting budgets and the number of officers. But don't get me wrong, we are not abandoning our communities to violence. We don't want to just close police departments, we want to make them obsolete. We should redirect the billions that now go to police departments toward providing health care, housing, education, and good jobs. If we did this, there would be less need for the police in the first place. We can build other ways of responding to harms in our society. Trained community care workers could do mental health checks instead of throwing people in prison. What about rape? The current approach hasn't ended it. In fact, most rapists never see the inside of a courtroom. 2/3 of people who experience sexual violence never report it to anyone. Those who file police reports are often dissatisfied with the response. Additionally, police officers themselves commit sexual assault alarmingly often. A study in 2010 found that sexual misconduct was the second most frequently reported form of police misconduct. In 2015, the Buffalo News found that an officer was caught for sexual misconduct every 5 days. When people, especially white people, consider a world without the police, they envision a society as violent as our current one, merely without law enforcement, and they shudder. As a society, we have been so indoctrinated with the idea that we solve problems by policing and caging people that many cannot imagine anything other than prisons and the police as solutions to violence and harm. People like me who want to abolish prisons and police, however, have a vision of a different society built on cooperation instead of individualism, on mutual aid instead of self-preservation. What would the country look like if it had billions of extra dollars to spend on housing, food, and education for all? And this has been a common theme of this show. We do have billions of extra dollars to spend if Congress decides to spend them that way. Just like it decides to spend money on interventionary war. Just like it decides to spend billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, bailing out banks and corporations. So this isn't a pipe dream, even though the 2 corporate-sponsored right-wing parties we now have will tell you so. They'll always say, "How are you going to pay for that?" As though we don't notice that we pay for other things easily without raising taxes. I keep harping on this because it's such an obvious way that they keep us in the dark. They try to pretend like we can't afford all this. We can afford to overhaul our society. We can afford to create a society that doesn't need police. We can also afford to create a society that doesn't need to bomb the shit out of other people in other parts of the world. And we could also afford to solve our climate crisis. And while we're at it, we could afford to solve student loan debt and the cost of educating our young people. Feel free to add your favorite projects in the comment section below with the clear understanding that if Congress decides that it's a priority, the Federal Reserve will spend the money into existence. All right, back to the article. This change in society wouldn't happen immediately, but the protests show that many people are ready to embrace a different vision of safety and justice. When the streets calm and people suggest once again that we hire more black police officers or create more civilian review boards, I hope that we remember all the times those efforts have failed. And I'll pair with that article this one, Joe Biden's Silence on Portland is Terrifying by Lauren Martinchek, because they fit together well. Fascism is beginning to tighten its grip, so why isn't the presumptive Democratic nominee saying a word? I'm not sure there are words to adequately describe how disturbing the events that have taken place in Portland, Oregon over these recent days actually are. The videos of unidentifiable federal officers snatching protesters off the streets and throwing them into minivans is something that should strike fear in every single person across the United States and serve as a clear indicator of what lies ahead in the days, weeks, and months to come as Donald Trump grows more and more desperate to retain his slipping grasp on power while the upcoming election approaches. Adding to the disturbing nature of these Gestapo-like figures roaming the streets of Portland is the fact that they aren't even cooperating with local police, let alone the city's mayor or other state governing bodies. While we might be hard-pressed to find her actually doing a single meaningful thing about it, Nancy Pelosi has taken to Twitter to address this escalation in conflict, writing, "Unidentified stormtroopers, unmarked cars, kidnapping protesters and causing severe injuries in response to graffiti. These are not the actions of a democratic republic. Department of Homeland Security's actions in Portland undermine its mission. Trump and his stormtroopers must be stopped." She went on to add, "First Amendment speech should never be met with one-sided violence from federal agents acting as Trump's secret police, especially when unidentified. This is disgraceful behavior we would expect from a banana republic, not the government of the United States." Not the government of the United States? Interesting, considering how this feels like the natural, ominous progression of the Patriot Act and its classification of domestic terrorism. The Patriot Act that Nancy Pelosi's Democratic majority Congress has reauthorized, and our presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden can be seen on the floor of the Senate proudly taking credit for writing. Speaking of Joe Biden, I find his complete, total silence when it comes to what can only be described as the kidnapping of Portland protesters, peaceful, legal protesters at that, as terrifying as it is telling. As the days go by and I continue to attempt to process what we've seen, I can't help considering the prospective theories as to why the man I am being told I have no choice but to vote for hasn't said a word about something so incredibly important. In all honesty, part of me can't help thinking that he doesn't truly mind it, for no reason other than the simple fact that it makes him look like an angel in comparison. Why instigate even more fierce backlash when there's an advisor in his ear casually reminding him how good this is for his election prospects, and a team of people surrounding him all but certain this will strike so much fear and desperation into people they'll find no excuse not to vote for him? I find it convenient, to say the least, that the man who has based his entire campaign platform around the fact that we're engaged in a battle for the soul of the nation falls entirely silent at a moment when the battle turns arguably more dangerous than it has before. It's nothing less than stunning to see how far to the right that the Democratic Party is willing to allow the country to go with nary more than a strongly worded tweet for nothing other than the fundraising money their resulting fear-mongering brings in. Another admittedly conspiratorial part of me can't help wondering if Joe Biden, or at the very least the elites advising and funding his campaign, want the civil unrest crushed as much as Donald Trump does. After all, it's much easier to continue the class warfare and leeching off of the middle class and working classes when the people aren't paying attention. All that being said, we've already seen how far the Obama administration itself was willing to go in their efforts to crush civil unrest. Like I said earlier, we have two right-wing parties. They both want to keep the poor people doing their fucking jobs. Let's not forget that Joe Biden was part of the administration that sent militarized shock troops in to crush Standing Rock and Ferguson protesters. Given the past experiences we've had with his leadership, Joe Biden's silence does absolutely nothing to ease my concerns about how far right the country will continue to grow under his administration. By all means, vote for him if you feel compelled to do so. And I'll stop there for a second. There is no morally defensible argument to vote for Joe fucking Biden. You can't look at yourself in the mirror and say that you're a moral person if you can vote for Joe Biden. So while Lauren will understand and will not argue with your decision, I will vote shame the fuck out of you from now until November and beyond. But the fitting conclusion is, but I do not want to hear ever again that he is going to be the answers to the problems we have every inclination to believe he will only continue to perpetuate on a smaller, far more intelligent scale. Now, if she says that Joe Biden is far more intelligent than Donald Trump, she may be right, but whoo boy, that's a tough one. We've got two cognitively impaired, racist rapists. That's quite a choice.